73-year-old Sherman Sizemore was the definition of a man's man. But in January, something changed in Sherman. He went from being this pillar in the community to being a deranged, paranoid lunatic. It all started on the afternoon of January 19th. Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him. And so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance and he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming. And so she just all day was comforting him and just dealing with these episodes. And then finally they got into bed that night. But when she woke up the next morning, Sherman had not slept at all. He looked worse than the day before. And so Ruby called the rest of the family. He told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. And his whole family had no idea what to do. Little did they know there was actually a very specific reason he was acting the way he was. A few months earlier, he began complaining of severe abdominal pains. And so he and his wife Ruby and his daughter, they went to the hospital, and the doctor determined that most likely his pain was coming from his gallbladder. But the only way to be sure would be to do some exploratory surgery. And so Sherman talked it over with his wife and his family, and they made the decision that they would go forward with the surgery. And so on the morning of January 19th, he goes into the hospital completely normal. He says bye to his family and prepped for surgery and then brought into the operating room. One of the nurses lowered the oxygen mask onto Sherman's face so the anesthesiologist could administer the that would knock him out for the surgery. However, the anesthesiologist only administered one of the two necessary. He administered the paralyzing, but he did not administer the actual anesthetic that would knock him out, and most importantly, would get rid of all of his pain. The nurse who was nearby told Sherman to go ahead and start counting backwards in his head from 10, and so he happily began counting in his head. When he reached 0, he realized he had not passed out. He began taking mental stock of what was going on, and he realized he could completely feel his body, but when he tried to move his body, he couldn't. He was completely paralyzed. When he tried to make a sound, he couldn't. The only thing he could move were his eyes. He could move them left and right. However, they had taped his eyes shut, so he can't see anything. After a few seconds, he's hearing the doctors and nurses in the room. They seem to be moving towards doing this operation, and he's still awake. And so Sherman becomes frantic and starts flicking his eyes left and right as fast as he possibly can. And the rapid eye movement actually loosened the tape on both of his eyelids, and it created a tiny slit that he could actually look through. And what he saw terrified him. The surgeon was walking over next to him. He was getting his gloves on. And then the surgeon says, "Scalpel." And the nurse hands him this chrome metallic blade. Sherman felt everything, but Sherman couldn't do anything about it. All he could do was rapidly flick his eyes left and right in hopes one of them would see that he was awake, but no one was paying attention to his face, so they didn't see his eyes moving around. The surgeon hands the scalpel to the nurse and says, "Clamps," at which point the nurse hands him what looks like a torture device, and the surgeon proceeds to use these clamps. Every little tug is sending lightning bolts of pain into Sherman's body. "Scope," the surgeon called out for, and the nurse handed him a camera. And then the surgeon said, "Suction," and the nurse got what looked like a vacuum. The pain Sherman was experiencing is unimaginable. Every second felt like an eternity. "Forceps," the surgeon called. By this point, Sherman wanted to die. He was no longer flicking his eyes left and right. He was just looking straight out, hoping someone would finally see him. And someone did. One of the nurses standing next to the surgeon looked up at Sherman's face and saw Sherman looking back, terrified at the nurse, at which point the nurse yelled out, "Stop, he's awake, he's awake!" And the surgeon practically faints, and he looks over at the anesthesiologist and he calls him, "Get over here and fix this." And as he's doing this, he has this moment of clarity. He remembers he didn't give him the anesthetic. And so as these new painkillers that have just been introduced begin to take their effect, Sherman's eyes go from being being terrified to glazed over, and he does pass off to sleep. And so now he's out and he can't feel anything. But now the anesthesiologist and the medical team realize they have a very big problem. This patient just experienced 16 minutes of surgery and felt all of it. And at the end of it, when he wakes up, he's going to remember it, and he's probably going to file a lawsuit against the hospital. And so a decision was made. It's unclear if the anesthesiologist acted alone or if the entire team was in on this. But regardless, the anesthesiologist administered an additional, better known as the amnesia. And like its nickname implies, anyone who gets it will forget what has just happened to them. The medical team, they went back to doing the surgery, they completed it, and they got him back out to recovery. And then when Sherman woke up in recovery, he did not remember what had happened to him inside of the operating room, at least not consciously. Those horrible 16 minutes had been implanted on Sherman's subconscious. Basically, his body recognized that he had experienced extreme trauma. However, the amnesia wiped away the memory of how he received that trauma. So there's this big disconnect in his memory. And so when Sherman came to in the recovery room, he immediately sensed something was horribly, horribly wrong. He was scared, he was anxious, he had this incredible sense of dread, but he had no memory to tie these feelings to. He had been completely happy and normal going into the surgery, and now a couple of hours later, he's a complete mess. And so he leaves the hospital that day on January 19th. He goes back to his house and he sits on the couch with his wife, and as he's sitting there, suddenly these horrible feelings he's having, they become too much, and he basically has a panic attack, and he starts screaming out, and he's terrified of something, but he doesn't know what it is. And then over the next couple of days, he began having these flashbacks where he would access the actual 16 minutes of torture he went through. He didn't think that happened to me and that's why I feel this way. Instead, he thought it was just this horrible nightmare that he couldn't escape from. And so his family did eventually start getting doctors and psychologists and all these people involved to figure out what was wrong with him. But before they could figure it out, the whole situation had just become too terrible for Sherman. And so on February 2nd, just 2 weeks after he came out of that surgery, he would take his own life. His family was unbelievably heartbroken. It didn't seem real that this had happened. And so they would continue to dig and figure out what went wrong. And they would finally get their hands on the medical report from the gallbladder exploratory surgery on January 19th. And after giving it to another doctor to look over, this doctor discovered that Sherman had in fact experienced 16 minutes of something known as anesthesia awareness, where you are awake or feel a portion of your surgery. And shockingly, this happens to 20,000 people a year. However, Sherman's case, 16 full minutes of this really intensive surgery that he felt, that is an absolute rarity. That does not happen very often. Sherman's family would go on to sue the hospital, and they would be awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the hospital in 2008. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.